Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. As it does on an annual basis, the U.S. has released its Intelligence Threat Assessment Report, honing in this specific part where we're going to be discussing the Middle East, saying that because of COVID-19, as well as ongoing wars and upheaval within the Middle East region, that the outlook for the Middle East is not very positive going forward at this point in time. Of course, I'm paraphrasing the report at this point in time. It also talks about economic crises, probably made significantly worse, as we would imagine, because of the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, there were a number of places, we can think of Lebanon and others, that probably were already still heading for economic crises altogether. Now, it does talk about some specific countries as well, talking about the likes of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. And of course, it does cover others as well on a more macro level also. And we're going to be trying to discuss those more specifically, as well as overall where exactly the region may be going wrong vis-a-vis its governance and leadership on these specific issues. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Matt Gordner, who is a senior strategist with Munathara Initiative. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto's Department of Political Science. He's joining us today from Tunis. Joining us today from Brussels is Serge, who is the Director of Europe and Middle East and North Africa region at the Institute for Economics and Peace. And joining us from London is Dr. Seyed Ali Alavi, who is a senior teaching fellow at SOAS at the University of London. Ali, Serge, and Matt, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Ali, I'd like to start with you. If we look at just Iran for a quick moment first, the report talks about essentially how Iran will continue to, in its words, seek to destabilize the region. Again, I'm paraphrasing the words that it's using, and will continue its sphere of influence, so to speak. Why is that a bad thing, I mean, necessarily, considering Iran is a part of the region?
Well, the report is quite politicized, as we know, and is coming at the same time that Iran and the members of JCPOA are negotiating to find a solution. Because, as we know, President Trump administration, previous administration, withdrew from the JCPOA, and actually by doing so, although Iran remained in JCPOA, but we had a political chaos and in the region since then. So to what the report comes at the time that the United States is trying, President Biden's administration, to get back into JCPOA. So it might be more of, let's say, political tool in order to affect the ongoing negotiations, perhaps. But we need to look into the causes of the elements. As we know, Iran is a regional power, member of the ECO, and member of also the Middle Eastern countries. So, in other words, we need to understand, and we need to get to the concept, to agree, and to see the position that Iran has played a significant role in fighting before against Taliban and ISIS, and now is playing a significant role in bringing all the elements, including Taliban and Afghanistan government, to negotiations. Also, supported Iraq, and while Iraq was facing a lot of, let's say, economic and political problems since 2003. But at the same time, as I mentioned, this is more of coincided with the negotiations. But the region now is suffering from something more, let's say, heartbreaking, which is the outbreak of COVID-19.
Indeed. From your vantage point there in Tunis, what are your thoughts about the report's mention, of course, of North Africa and specifically, of course, of Libya, but just in general also about the Middle East, in the sense that in Libya, of course, there has been more positive news recently in the sense that there is seemingly, a progress towards more stable governance and more united governance, hopefully. But overall, the picture remains one of chaos, doesn't it?
I don't know if chaos is particularly the word I would use. I think that the Middle East and North Africa has fared fairly well compared to other countries across the globe when you look at the impact of COVID. Of course, the fact that the Middle East and North Africa is an authoritarian region poses some obstacles, developmentally and also politically, to the United States. But there are many ways that you could turn the table around and beg what part the United States has played in destabilizing the region in the first place. I agree that this is sort of a politically motivated line of argument. But at the same time, we shouldn't detract from the fact that the region itself is doing much better than the world would expect.
Interesting. And Serge, I know you travel quite a bit to the region sometimes as well. What are your thoughts about what you've seen, what you've spoken to, and what people in the region say specifically about obviously the kind of effect that the pandemic may have had, but even before that, economic crisis, as I said in my introduction, for example, in a place like Lebanon, was pretty much a known issue anyhow.
Well, when you look at this region, and you're absolutely right to say that there has been an improvement there for the region. When you look at our global peace index, we see that the region, Middle East, Northern Africa, is in a better shape today than it was 4 to 5 years ago. So this is really very well. On another side, what we have done as research at the Institute for Economics and Peace would focus at the levels of civil unrest. And there in the past decade, we have seen an increase by almost 300% of the levels of civil unrest, and most of the civil unrest being turning violent. I would say more than 40% in the region of these unrest would turn violent. And there we clearly see that the socio-economic, I would say, foundation of this unrest has not been addressed in the past decade. And that COVID-19, yes, it is a pandemic. Yes, it is also an emerging economic crisis, but it is especially putting a strain on the socio-economic tissue of these different societies. And so the reasons that were there for unrest and destabilization before are only going to be exacerbated by the effect of both the pandemic and the economic crisis that result of the pandemic. On the other side, when you would focus on Iran, for example, well, you can see that neither the sanctions nor some form of popular uprising, neither lethal waves of COVID-19 have resulted in a change of political outlook and the position towards other countries in the region, but also on a global scale. And that is something that is really remarkable also.
You know, Ali, one of the interesting things when it comes to the U.S. role in the Middle East, and I'm looking at this overall, is that, you know, in some places it seems like we want the U.S. to be involved to an extent, for example, re-entering the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and living up to its commitments there, right? But then in other places, for example, the Iraqis want seemingly the Americans out. And in Afghanistan, we've already had Biden, for example, announcing that they'll be leaving from Afghanistan as well towards the end of this year. Do you think that it's sort of a mix-up then about places where the U.S. should still be involved, or is this a time for the U.S. to really step back and let the region handle its own issues?
Well, the causes of some of the issues that we have in the Middle East, we need to go back to 2003 when the invasion of Iraq was implemented by the Bush administration. And since then, when the whole state of Iraq collapsed, and then there is a history about how administration Washington miscalculated, and the policies actually created that kind of a chaos and sectarian and the civil unrest in Iraq. So the United States during Obama had projected and engineered that JCPOA and Iran always been part of it even before, and invited the global powers and regional powers. So it was a step towards kind of, let's say, productive direction. But then we have, again, the Trump administration withdrawing and imposing harsh sanctions on Iran. And imposing sanctions on Iran is not just having impacts on Iran per se. We live in a globalized world. As you can see, the whole region has been affected. Pakistan and Turkey and Iraq and the rest of the Middle Eastern countries are suffering from the imposed sanctions by the United States. So now Biden administration, President Biden is trying to withdraw from Afghanistan or engaged in Iraq, or let's say discussing about JCPOA. I think the best way would be for United States to reverse the withdrawal and then come back to JCPOA and remove the sanctions. As I mentioned, those sanctions are not only affecting Iran and the Iranian people, but affecting the countries. We are living in a volatile region, and Afghanistan needs to be rebuilt fully, Iraq the same, and Syria. And of course, imposing sanctions on Iran affected the whole region and the whole nations in the Middle East is counterproductive from every angle, if you look at it.
Matt, what are your thoughts about ongoing U.S. involvement? Because, you know, the way I see it, for example, I mean, if I may use Afghanistan for a moment as an example, people would say that it's irresponsible of the U.S. That's the argument on some people's part for the U.S. to just leave now, right? After all these years where the U.S. has essentially not necessarily achieved all of its goals, that it's irresponsible to just leave the Afghan people on their own. On the other side, of course, the argument remains that the U.S. should just leave the region, period, to stop interfering. The peoples of the region should be handling their own issues altogether. And I would imagine these arguments go for other hotspots as well, such as Syria, Iraq, even Libya as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in terms of Afghanistan, I think that Biden's retort was reasonable. If it's not this year, then could it be next year? Could it be the year after? And he proclaimed that he did not want to leave that responsibility to the fifth president to be in Afghanistan. In terms of the region generally, I think the United States has egg on its face following the Trump administration. And so the Biden administration has a real opportunity to restart relations with the region as a whole. If I were Biden, I would do so starting in Tunisia, where there's a clear need to promote more democratic governance. Although nominally a democratic state, Tunisia demonstrates really, really deep legacies of authoritarianism and a very strong police state that needs to, at some point, be held to account. Of course, neo-imperialism is a very fun and floaty term to use, but on a very practical level, the United States has its fingers deep in a lot of pies. It would be difficult simply to pull out of the Middle East and North Africa. And so the United States should come up with a reasonable plan of supporting further democratization and human rights in the region, especially given the fact, as your other guest said, COVID-19 really demonstrated the weaknesses and structural blunders in this very, very authoritarian region. What the COVID-19 pandemic did was to show that the states are actually not ready when there is a shock to the system. The health sectors, the security sectors, they're simply not set up for this kind of thing.
Serge, what are your thoughts about, again, what the U.S. role should be going forward? Because, you know, I would think that it's easy, isn't it, to blame Donald Trump? For example, I mean, I'm thinking also about the Middle East peace plan that Jared Kushner had come up with that has essentially failed spectacularly, right? Where the Palestinians weren't even brought onto the negotiating table to discuss that plan to begin with before it was even publicized in any ways. I mean, that's just one example, but then previously we've had, for example, involvement in Libya, as the other guests mentioned, Iraq as well, and Afghanistan. They've all been fairly unsuccessful in many ways, haven't they?
Thank you very much for the question. I think we need to step down from this fairy tale that would make us believe that the military intervention is bringing peace in the country. What we have seen, and we have received the examples from Iraq in 2003 and Afghanistan the years before, we have seen in the beginning a very swift and a very successful military operation, basically topping a government. But then the question is, how do I now rebuild this country? How do I build a peaceful society? How do I build a very strong society? And this is where I think we have failed in the past 20 to 25 years. So when you talk about the United States pulling out of Iraq, pulling out of Afghanistan, maybe not being so active in Syria anymore, I think this is an option, and of course it's going to have consequences. But and I think I'm really supporting Matt's argument about this. The United States might also have another role to play in this peace building in the region and in this reinforcement of the democratic values and strength in societies. You need to invest in other actions than just the military action to create strong and resilient societies. And I think this is a role that might be there, that might be present for the United States and other actors of the region. You asked me in your first question about my impressions of the region. Well, look at the new ties between Israel and some countries like the UAE in the Gulf region. This is almost entirely based on trade and economic relations. And this economic interconnection between maybe opponents or former opponents, even within societies or in the region or globally, this is going to create peace. And this is another action to create peace, more positive peace.
Okay, so let's talk about Palestine for a moment, if we may, Ali, because that's a huge, huge issue within the Middle East, or it has been at least in the past. I mean, until we've had these normalization of ties, a lot of these countries will continue to say that, listen, Palestine is the central issue and that needs to be resolved for regional peace. Do you think that that has taken a back seat now, and what does that then mean for the region?
Well, the Palestinian question, we have a number of questions in the Middle East that needs to be sorted and solved. But one thing before we get to the Palestinian issue is that I'm quite surprised that we always talk about United States needs to do this, or United States is in charge. We are living in a multipolar system. We have emerging powers: India, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and we have European Union and China. And China now is actually getting more involved. So I think the Palestinian cause that has been more than 7 decades, and there was no tangible results in it, and still Palestinians are not having an independent state, and there's still 1967 occupied territories are not handed back to the Palestinians and all the rest of it. I think this is our responsibility for all the regional powers and global powers, not only the United States, to be the only mediator and only director in the peace. I think that all the states, including Iran, Turkey, Pakistan, China, and European Union and Russia, should be involved in this concept. And because it has been monopolized by the United States, the peace process, we see there is no tangible any result since all these agreements are done. In terms of agreement between the Persian Gulf states, such as UAE and Bahrain, with Israel, I think it's more of economic connections or perhaps security issues. But it might be in the long term counterproductive because the issue of Palestine hasn't been solved yet. There is no discussion about the Palestinian cause, and we are actually talking about the people in the streets in the Middle East. So I think they need to see proper, tangible movement towards that direction. And Palestinians should be the one to actually say what they need to achieve. And I can see they don't receive any agency here, as if Palestinian people don't exist. All the peace agreements and discussions are between a few number of states without having the Palestinian people, let's say in Gaza, which is suffering from enormous amount of sanctions. They don't have any say to say.
I apologize for cutting in. I do apologize. We're quickly running out of time, so I just wanted to, with your permission, give Matt the final word before letting all three of you go. Matt, we just have about a minute and a half left. On the issue of Palestine, I wonder where your thoughts are on that, because Serge is right that yes, of course, a lot of those normalization of ties are based on trade and economic ties, and I think those countries haven't really made a secret of it either. But is that the path to peace?
I don't necessarily think it's the path to peace, but I think that there's a path-dependent process here wherein the United States very much entrenched itself in the conflict early on. So bringing China and Iran in to help mediate the conflict or support Palestinians, I think at this point is somewhat meaningless. Yet again, though, I think the Biden administration has an opportunity here to support free and fair Palestinian elections, to seek out the grassroots. Because remember that right now the lists are comprised mostly of an older generation of Palestinians, whereas the younger generation very much wants to be involved in politics. There's a very high rate going to the polls, and yet have very little say in what's going on in Palestinian politics today. So if the Biden administration wanted to find some legitimacy for the Palestinian cause, it would find a way of doing so with the involvement of a polarity of actors and to find some free and fair election to come out and to give Palestinians some legitimacy in that process.
Very well. We'll leave it there. I really appreciate Matt, Serge, and Ali for taking their time out of their no doubt busy schedules this Friday to discuss. We discussed quite a bit, didn't we? We got through a lot of the Middle East and a lot of the specific countries, as well as the macro issues that the region faces. The U.S. intelligence report, again, on an annual basis, not painting a very pretty picture of the Middle East going forward, specifically within the context of the pandemic, but even without that, talking about governance issues, economic crises, etc. Of course, worsened because of the pandemic, but a lot of of those issues were there before as well. Authoritarianism, as Matt there mentioned and other guests mentioned as well. The issue of Palestine still very much an open wound, if I may use that term, as many Middle Easterners would probably see it as. But we also have significant other hotspots such as Syria, Iraq, Libya, even to an extent, and all of the above has some form of U.S. involvement, and that also is an important part to discuss, right? Because the politicization of these sorts of reports, they don't discuss necessarily the U.S. role in bringing about these many issues that may exist, direct or indirect, and that can be debated as well. But should the U.S. be remaining in the region to begin with, and in what form? What exactly should it be doing going forward to ensure then peace, stability, and good governance for all peoples in the Middle East? I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss France once again. And we've discussed France quite a bit over the past months, even more, in fact. And this time, we're going to discuss what's been called Islamo-Leftism within France, or Islamo-Gauchism, I believe, as it's called in French. We've had the French Minister of Higher Education, Frédéric Vidal, who has spoken about Islamo-Leftism within academic institutions in France, saying that this is essentially a threat to France and the way that universities, etc., operate vis-a-vis exchange of free ideas, etc., that there is too much of a left-wing tilt at times within these universities. And this then covers a whole range of things. So we're not just talking about, for example, Islam specifically. We're talking about decolonializing studies, studies on whole variation of colonial activities, as well as a whole bunch of other things we could probably list quite and make quite a long list of. Let me put that now to our guests who are joining us. All of them are joining us today from France. We're joined by Dr. Raphael Liogier, who is a professor of sciences politics. He's a visiting researcher at Columbia University as well, and is a teacher at the International College of Philosophy and researcher as well as Sophia Pohl. He's joining us today from Marseille. Joining us from the French capital, Paris, is Yasser Louati, who is the head of the Justice and Liberties for All Committee. He's also the host of the podcast The Breakdown. And joining us from Cassis is Dr. Maboula Soumahoro, who is an associate professor at the University of Tours. She's a specialist in Africana studies. Maboula, Yasser, and Raphael, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Maboula, let me start with you, if I may. We've had this open letter that around 400 plus global scholars have written, essentially denouncing this entire idea of going after Islamo-Leftism as a whole. What are your thoughts about this issue to begin with? I mean, is this a threat within French academic institutions?
I don't know if this could be perceived as a threat. I don't know how many people are truly, in terms of the number of scholars, researchers, doctoral students who might be investigating the topics that are under attack by the government and other segments of French society. I don't know where the threat is coming from, but I think that the threat for the general country might be, the issue of racism and how it is causing tensions to the entire country. But when it comes to the university per se, I don't know what the government is talking about, honestly.
Well, you're also an academic. What are your thoughts about this? Is there a threat within academia of Islamo-Leftism?
I'm not only an academic. I was targeted. I was one of the first one to be targeted around 4 or 5 years ago to be one of those Islamo-leftists. And because I went to Columbia University, they forgot a little bit about me, but I was one of the first one to be targeted. And I tried to understand what happened to me. Why am I supposed to be an Islamo-leftist? What does that even mean? And I discovered step by step, trying to study sociologically what actually happened to me. And I saw that it is just one reason, is that in 2012, I wrote a book that was quite successful in France that is called The Myth of Islamization. And I tried to show that the fear of Islam was kind of a pretext of a deep identity crisis of French people that involve, as you said, the fact that France can't deal with his past as his colonial past, and the loss of symbolic power, of military power, of economic power all over the world, etc., etc. And I saw that just the fact that I deal with that, and just the fact that I was pointing out Islamophobia, that made me an Islamo-gauchist, an Islamo-leftist, in English. So it's deeply related to this crisis that is actually now that is having France with its own identity, with its own past.
You know, it's saying Yasser, because at the same time this is happening, we also have many people around the world praising Macron, right, for saying that, for example, what occurred in Algeria during colonial rule and during the war there for independence specifically, that many mistakes happened on the French part as well as, and and there's been this effort seemingly to return some artifacts to some African countries. I mean, on the other side, there's been this public aim to try to show a good face of France, that it's coming to terms with its colonial past and atrocities that may have been committed by it, but at the same time now we have this effort to talk about it. I mean, that's sort of confusing, isn't it?
This is where we see the double discourse of Emmanuel Macron, if I may say. There is Emmanuel Macron speaking to an international audience and posing as this liberal president who defeated Marine Le Pen in 2017, who would also be the guarantee that French democracy will survive thanks to him. But there is also the Macron at home who is promoting both the anti-separatism bill, which is frankly, a anti-Muslim bill that is cracking down on their human rights and civil liberties, but also cracking down on any person who questions the status quo. But let's go back to the question of Islamo-Leftism. The term actually came back to France in 2002. It's actually a British term from Chris Harman, who conceived the idea of an alliance between the far left, which would ally itself with Muslim organizations in its struggle against Western imperialism. Pierre-André Taguieff brought the term back in France when he saw in the early 2000s the rising convergence between left-wing organizations and Muslim organizations, with Palestine being the glue between these two nebulae. Now, for Emmanuel Macron to pretend that he is somehow a liberal president, but at the same time he promotes the very idea that any scholar who questions the status quo, who wants to decolonialize studies, we have with us here Maboula Soumahoro, who's been excellent on these issues. Those people, when they question the status quo, they are deemed Islamo-Leftism, that you are promoting an alliance between Islamism on the one hand and left-wing ideologies. That does not exist. And as a matter of fact, nobody could ever define it. But what we see again today happening in France is an acceleration of history and a further drift towards the far right. And Emmanuel Macron, he can speak internationally about, colonization was evil, but what's happening at home is actually the opposite of that.
What do you make of that, Maboula? Because as I put to Yasser, it's very confusing messages for us on the outside, right? I mean, how important is it for France, for example, to talk about its colonial past, to talk about racism, to have these very open conversations, especially within an academic atmosphere?
I think it is crucial for France at the moment to discuss this problematic past, to reckon with the reality of history, and also to find itself as a country in this post-colonial moment. France has to deal with that history because of post-colonial migration that comes essentially from former colonies. And let's keep in mind that France is still an empire because the country retains to this day territories, regions, departments that are scattered in all, the world's seas and oceans. I'm talking about, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyana. I'm talking about Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean. I'm talking about Mayotte, and I'm talking about the Pacific Ocean. So all present, vestiges empire need to be reckoned with, because within hexagonal France, there is an increasing number of people who have come from overseas territories that are are still, colonies or departments today, or that were former colonies. So it simply has become impossible for France to avoid the topic. So on the one hand, as Yasser just said, on the one hand, let's say the government, the administration has those issues, and on the other hand, some fringes of the French population still have difficulty envisioning France in its total reality. That is to say, France outside of Europe, France outside of the hexagon, and France in its imperial dimension. And this is the tough questions that we have to deal with, whether people like it or not. This is impossible to avoid. We are at this moment in history where avoidance is no longer possible, when before that the dichotomy between distant territories and the hexagonal, that is to say European part of France, was doable. Today it's no longer doable in that particular manner.
Raphael, what is the goal here through this sort of, if I may use control or targeting? I mean, if we're targeting, for example, Islamo-Leftists within academia or otherwise, is the goal to stifle discussion altogether? Because, I mean, that then goes against the very moral authority of France, right? Because I would think that France would then point to other countries around the world, say, see, we're better than you because we allow for free speech and free discussion. But then it seems it's actually doing the opposite within its country, as Yasser and Maboula there have alluded to.
I think Emmanuel Macron knows about that, but he's just playing the next election that is happening in a very short while, like next year, because in fact, since 2003, around 2003, France started to face a very deep identity crisis. Thinking that it doesn't have his place anymore in a globalization process, even in global capitalism and all that, And there was this fight between universalism, liberalism, etc., and on the other side, a new identitarism, like very populist way to think about France, being attacked all around, and Muslims were targeted as being the main enemies of France, enemies of our identity. And so for the last 10 years, there was this fight. And in the last election, 4 years ago exactly, Emmanuel Macron was elected in the name of universalism, of the liberal part, against Marine Le Pen, that was the identitarist part. But in the middle of his governance, in the middle, like 2 years ago, he changed his mind because he saw that he would not be elected. He thought, at least, he would not be elected if he didn't change side. So he really changed side because he was completely opposite to that 5 years ago, and now he changed completely because he saw that even in his own party, if he carries on with the universalist, liberal, economic reform, he will not be elected. So that he changed completely his way because he saw that. But I think he doesn't even believe in it. It's what is worse in a way, I think.
Yasser, it's interesting, right? We keep saying that, and I know we've spoken about this a number of times before too, that Macron is going down this path because he realizes that, his political career is really at stake here, like in the sense that Le Pen has more and more support as the years go by. But that in and of itself is then a judgment on French society and France as a nation too, isn't it? Because, it's easy to just blame Macron or just blame Le Pen, but then at some point, if the majority of people are heading in this very right-wing direction in their ideology, there's something very wrong here. What's gone wrong?
We have to be careful in order not to give Emmanuel Macron an emergency exit or an escape route, and for him to say, well, I'm doing all that just to defeat Marine Le Pen. Emmanuel Macron believes in what he's doing. Because we have to keep in mind that Emmanuel Macron gave no guarantees he was going to be this anti-racist president who was going to promote a complete French identity with its whites, its blacks, its Romas, its Arabs, its Muslims, etc. That's going to be anti-sexist and whatnot. No. from the beginning, he was on the one day he would say the colonization of Algeria was evil. The next day he catches heat from the right. He would say, no, I take it back. And for Emmanuel Macron to think that he's somehow doing that just to play on the ground field of Marine Le Pen, we have to keep in mind that he surrounded himself with the most notorious Islamophobes of the past 30 years. People like the Laurent Bouvet from the Printemps Républicain, who is a staunch secular fundamentalist promoting a left-wing Islamophobia. People like Catherine Kinsler, Jean-Michel Blanquer, his Minister of Education, just bragged last week that his vision of a staunch anti-Muslim laicity won in the Macron government. So he cannot, on the one hand, pretend to play the far-right card to get re-elected, and at the same time get himself surrounded by staunch Islamophobes like even Gérald Darmanin. The second point, in this country, we have two theories of the Great Replacement. The notorious one from the right, the Great Replacement from Camus, but also the left-wing Great Replacement theory from the left called cultural insecurity, that the rising visibility of blacks and Arabs is problematic in and of itself. So no, Emmanuel Macron believes in what he's doing, and to give even more of a proof that he's doing it on purpose, one of his friends is Philippe de Villiers, a historic far-right leader, and he had no problem going to visit him in his area in southwest of France. So no, Emmanuel Macron is firmly believing what he's doing, and to him the gamble is, if I go play the far-right card, I will win the election. Maybe Marine Le Pen will win this time.
So Maboula, if I may, I want to go back to that point about the French nation. And of course, I don't want to generalize and say, everybody in France is racist or anti-Islam or anti-Black, etc. I just certainly don't want to say that, because that would be much too much of a generalization. But I mean, in the sense that if politicians are heading in this right-wing direction, does that automatically mean the nation and the people are also heading in that direction?
I think this is a very fair question, but we have to pay attention to, of course, the collective opinion, but we have to pay attention to the administrations in power. So whatever is going on in the larger society remains, doesn't make any sense if the opinions of the larger society is not reflected in the policies carried out by the governments in power. So I agree with you, of course, in France, it's not about saying, every French national is a racist person, but the issue remains who's in power. So, of course, society is pushing back against those racist policies, those racist, statements, those limitations of liberty, but they are pushing the French general population that is more inclusive, more racist, that is ready and willing to go back and reflect the past and the meaning of the past and the consequences on the present. So those people who are emerging and who are in favor of a new discourse on the French national, identity and French history is really the reason why the governments, it's to me, it doesn't make any sense to reflect on, the honesty of Emmanuel Macron. Whatever he thinks as an individual is being incorporated in the policies he's able to launch. So we don't care about his honesty, really. We really care about his political agenda. So the reason why there is such strong attacks on particular, discourses, particular themes of research has to do with the fact that there is a growing segment of the French society who's really pushing against this, unbelievable discourse and unbelievable, policies carried out. So I think that what can be seen as very, pessimistic, politically speaking, is really could also be interpreted as a good sign. The only reason why the attack is so strong is because the resistance is very strong. Otherwise, they wouldn't have to pass new laws. They wouldn't have to make all those statements. They wouldn't have to limit liberties if they were that comfortable. So this is another way to look at the situation.
And that's a very good point, in fact. Well, we're just quickly running out of time, so I want to give you the final word. We have about a minute left. On that question then of resistance, I mean, yes, as Maboula there said, the fact that you have these laws and the fact that these issues are being discussed means that there is resistance. Is there hope?
Resistance in the university. That's the reason why the university is targeted. because if we don't look at the university and we look at the general public, I've followed the different surveys and, from around 2010 to now, and it's really something that we have to worry about, because there was between 60% and 80% of French people that thinks that will answer to the question that Islam is a problem in itself. And many of the answers will look a little bit like somehow what we could call this new cultural racism, not only towards Muslim, but all what is around people that are immigrants and other kind of people that are supposed to be minorities. So there is a real problem now in the French society. And yes, there is hope. There is hope in university debates, for instance. And that's, as I tell you, that's the reason why Emmanuel Macron wants to target the universities, because it comes from there, mainly, actually.
Very well. We really appreciate the Raphael, Yasser, and Maboula for this very interesting and wide-ranging discussion. We got through quite a few issues pertaining to Islamo-Leftism as it's been discussed by Frédéric Vidal, the Minister of Higher Education there in France, as well as a whole host of other French cabinet members and officials, saying this is a threat to France, that that this is just left-wing ideology. They're essentially now seeking seemingly to target, colonial studies, anti-racist studies, anti-Islamophobia projects. I mean, the list is fairly endless, and it covers a lot of people. So we're not just talking about Muslims. We're talking about people of color. We're talking about people of other ethnicities. And then, as Yasser there discussed, there's two great replacement theories in France. One is more cultural, and the other is the one that we discuss more readily, as in the white man essentially being replaced in his own nation. This is all extremely disturbing, as I said, for a country that would seek to show itself as having moral authority over all others when it comes to free speech. But in fact, what it's doing is anti-free speech. So this sort of just doesn't work together side by side. One side has to give over the other. And unfortunately, at this point, it seems like it's the side that is going to be on the wrong side of history when it comes to these issues. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.